All right, y'all can have a seat. Someone get the lights. Oh, this isn't youth group. That's how it usually works. I say, all right, you guys can have a seat. Someone get the lights by the door. But the lights are already on. Alan, get the lights for me. So my wife was supposed to be here with us tonight, and we were going to tag team preach this. So when I'm preaching for part of this, I'm going to be using her words that she wrote, and I'll tell you when that is. I am not pulling a Pastor Jim tonight. I do not have very many scriptures. If you are reading on electronic devices, I'll be reading out of the New Living Translation. So all of it is out of the New Living Translation. But listen, tonight the title of my message is called Dangerous Prayers, right? We've been fasting and praying the start of week 3. It's this week, and we're on the roll to finish off this 21 days. If you haven't yet, there are paper over there, because Pastor Jim apparently forgot to announce it this morning. If you need a paper, they're over there. If you're doing it online, we'll see you online. I try to do it at 6 a.m. because if I don't do it at all. So I got to do it before I roll out of bed. But listen, last week in the Sunday morning message, Pastor Jim kind of ended his message talking about the prayer that me and Kelsey had been studying on together. And we've actually been studying on this for a while. There's a book called Dangerous Prayer that I read, and I kind of showed it to Kelsey, and we began to talk about it. And so if you'll turn with me to Psalms 139, verse 23 through 24. Psalms 139, 23 through 24. If you're in the house, it's behind me. If you're on the live feed, it's like right down there somewhere. So if you're in the house, it's up there. Live feed, it's below my feet. If you're reading your Bible in here, good job. Psalms 139, 23 through 24. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life. This is a very dangerous prayer when you begin to actually study it out and what David is actually praying here. It's a really, really intricate prayer that we just kind of sometimes skim over, or we just kind of throw it out to God like, hey, I read Psalms today, so I'm going to pray this. But the reality is when you begin to look at it, it becomes a very dangerous thing to ask God to do. And so Kelsey and I began to pray this prayer in our life, like I said, when I read this book. And it's kind of one of those things that we kind of have been keeping an eye on each other. Because if you're focused on this prayer and what it truly means, you'll begin to see when you're not living in this prayer in your life. And so sometimes Kelsey will have an attitude in an area she shouldn't have an attitude, and I'll say, hey, have you prayed Psalms 139? And she'll catch me having an attitude about things I shouldn't have an attitude about, and she'll say, have you read Psalms 139? That's the way I hear it, because I have an attitude already. That's probably not how she said it. She probably was really nice about it, but I already had an attitude, and that's the way I heard it. And so that's how she says it. Now, she really says it nice, but what happens is if you really are careful and you begin to watch the people in your life and yourself and you begin to set up accountability, you'll see that this prayer becomes very dangerous as we get into it. So Alan, if you go to the next slide, we're going to break this down by parts. And the first part says, search me, O God, and know my heart. So first thing David penned, right? The end of Psalms 139, these are the last two scriptures. David came to the God of perfect knowledge and constant presence, knowing he was also a God of love and could be trusted to search him and know him at the deepest level. This is also an admission that God knew David better than David knew himself, and that he needed God to search and know him. I don't know about you, but there's times in my life where I thought I had it all going on, and I knew what was the best for me. And I was about 16, and I got my license, and I knew what the best thing for me was. And I was far from wrong. But David here begins his prayer, and search me, O God, and know my heart. And it starts with very simple. But David understood that God knows me better than I know myself. You see these lights, for those who are in house, you can see these lights we put on up here. I have another friend who has these lights also. And when we put them up and we were looking for lights to put up, he was like, yeah, you need to get these. They're super cheap and they work, and this is what you need to do, and this is how you need to do it. And I was like, yeah, I'll just use his intelligence to figure out how to get these lights to work. And they didn't work the way he was telling me that they worked. And so instead, I had to go to the manufacturer who created the lights to figure out how the lights worked and not rely upon the knowledge I thought I knew from secondhand nature that someone told me I should know about the lights. Right. And the reality of it is that when we come to God, we come with secondhand knowledge of who we think we are. We think, according to what society has told us, some of us may have a really ugly self-image of ourselves. That you're not good enough. You'll never be enough. You better be paying attention to me, teenagers. Oh, that one slipped in there, no. But you're never good enough, and you're not going to make it, and you don't have the right education, and why would someone look at you at all the mess you've made in your life? And so we come to God like that. God, I'm not good enough. I don't know why you picked me. God, I'm never going to make it. I don't have the right capabilities. I did the wrong stuff in my past. I'm not good enough. And David said, no. God, search me and know me. You know me better than me. You created me, and you put into me exactly what I needed for exactly the plan you had for my life. You put in the backpack of my life everything I would need for the journey. You put in David's life the fact that he killed a lion and a bear so that when he met the giant, he could go to King Saul and say, no, in my backpack that God already gave me, I killed a lion and a bear. That's right. You see, when we begin to say, God, search me and know me, we begin to open up and say, God, I know everything about me. In fact, in verse 1 through 6, if you'll start there, Alan, in verse 1, David, in this exact same chapter, pens this. O Lord, you have examined my heart, and you know everything about me. You know when I sit down or I stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. Listen, I got a smart mouth, so when it says, you know what I'm going to say before I say it, I read that and I say, God, if you would just stop me from saying it, I would have not gotten in so much trouble as a kid. If you knew what I was going to say, if you could have just whoop, cover my mouth and not let me say it, that would have been great. But the beginning of this verse, David begins to write in the beginning of this chapter, God, you know me. When I sit down, when I stand up, when I'm traveling, when I'm at home. You know everything about me. So why then at the end of the chapter does he say, search me and know me? Because the Bible said God created you, but God is not going to invade your life. He's waiting for an invitation. And even though he created you, and he knows you, and he knows when you're going and when you're not, and when you're coming and you're sitting and you're standing. Even though he knows that, the beginning of this dangerous prayer is search me and know me. So point number 2 was supposed to be my wife. Go ahead to point number 2. And it says, test me and know my anxious thoughts. So David wanted to examine God. David wanted God to examine him and look for worry. This is from Kelsey. This is exact quotation. She told me I could say this. Earlier this year, as we started the fast and prayer, I told Jake that I was really about to be done praying. It seemed like the more I prayed, the more things started to unravel. It felt like every prayer I prayed was going unanswered, or the exact opposite of what I was praying for happened. She said, I prayed for our finances and have still not been back to stable. She said, I prayed about our life and things began to get worse, it seemed like. And she said, I prayed about our son and he turned around and got sick. And I prayed about you and you're, she said, you were struggling. And she said, everything inside of me began to worry about everything outside of me. And she said, and then you brought up that you wanted to teach on this. And I said, welcome to being a pastor, because what you're going through is going to come out when you preach. Whether you want to or not, it's going to come out. But she said, my worry about finances, my worry about my life, my worry about my son, my worry about my husband, all began to put something inside of me. And that was anxiety because of unbelief and mistrust I had in God. She said, because I worried about everything, I could never trust God about anything. And she said, it really makes me mad that your dad, when she's frustrated, it's always your dad. When your dad had to preach my message last Sunday because everything he talked about, I had already written. And I was like, well, sorry, that's just kind of the way it works. But the reality of it is this. She said, such anxiety is evidence of unbelief or misplaced trust towards God. She said, anxiety about our finances took away the trust that God is a provider. She said, anxiety about my life took away that Jeremiah 29:11 says he has plans for me. Anxiety about my son took away the fact that God gave me him, that we prayed over him, and that we know things are going to be okay. And she said, what happened in my life was that I stopped asking God to test me and know my anxious thoughts. And I responded and I told her, I said, not really, because what's really happening is God is showing you in this moment all the anxiety that you've been carrying. And how rough it is for you to have that in your life. And I said, here's what happens when you allow worry to set up anxiety in your life and heart. All of this can change by putting your heart back into alignment the way it's supposed to be. So when you say, God, test me and know my anxious thoughts, guess what? Be willing for your anxiety to come to the surface. And the reason I say that, I'm not saying is that God is going to bring on a panic attack or an anxiety attack. What he's going to begin to do is he's going to begin to raise the level until you decide to put trust back in God. And things are going to begin to get ugly until you decide to put trust back in God. God, test me and show my anxious thoughts. Okay. And put a little pressure on you. And see if you're ready to really want me to test you. Because most of the time in school, the teacher never speaks during the test. They're always quiet. So when you say, God, test me, sometimes it feels like I don't want to pray anymore because every time I pray, it's wrong. I prayed and it never happened. Or I prayed and the exact opposite thing happened. And sometimes in my mind, Because I had a teacher who did this. He would pass out the test. He'd sit down, and both feet, bang, up on his desk. And he'd sit there for the whole 50-minute class. He wouldn't say a word to anybody. He'd just sit there, feet up, staring, waiting. Then he'd bring tests up at the end of the class. Why? Because he had already done what he was supposed to do. He taught us. He gave it to us. And now he's waiting on our response to what was given to us. So when we say, test me and know my anxious thoughts, I see God going, okay, I gave you everything. And now I'm going to sit back and I'm going to wait. And the last thing, the part 3, I really like the way the Message Bible says this. It says, point out anything in me that offends you. That's tough. Anything. That means the TV shows you're watching. Anything. That means the music you listen to. Anything. That means the relationships you're in. The friendships you carry. That means anything. Anything in your life that is offensive to God, when you pray this prayer, is going to begin to show up. And now is the hard part, because the decision becomes yours. Am I going to follow God down the path of everlasting life, or am I going to hold on to what offends God? Am I going to hold on to the addiction that God told me to lay down because it's something I need, yet it's offensive to God? Am I going to hold on to that TV show because I'm 20 seasons in, 25 episodes in each season, even though it's offensive to God, but I'm almost finished with it? Are we willing to give it up? You see, this isn't just me preaching to you, bringing up scenarios. These are things that God has dealt with me on when I asked him, point out anything in me that offends you. Because sometimes we think maybe it's a sin that offends God. Maybe it's not so much a sin. Maybe it's the way you reacted to that situation. Because the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. I just did a whole series and I quoted it wrong, and I learned it that way, and now I can't get it out of my mind. So every time I quote it wrong, my one girl over here decides to tell me that faithfulness comes before gentleness. So that's why I will continue to say it wrongly. But you see, maybe it's that you didn't have gentleness when you should have. You see, I'm not telling you that your offense to God is not, it doesn't have to be a sin every time. Maybe it's that we didn't have the character of God when we should have. And we acted a little bit like this old fleshly man instead of the God inside of our spirit. So tonight, I just want to close like this. This dangerous prayer is dangerous because first it opens you up vulnerable to God. Search me and know me. I've never been to jail, but I believe from what I've understood, when they search you, it's a pretty vulnerable state you're in when they search you. Pretty vulnerable state. And what happens is this, is that when you go to God in point number 1 and you say, search me, you're asking God to strip you from the top of your head to the soles of your feet and say, look me over. What inside of me, what in me needs to happen? Then you're asking God to test your anxious thought, and you need to understand that when you ask God that, you may have some stressful situations come up in your life. But he's waiting to see your reaction. Is your reaction going to be like, Kelsey, I'm done praying for the rest of the year? Because every time I pray, it never turns out. I wanted it this way, but because it didn't happen this way, my anxiety is even higher because this prayer was going to take care of it. finally she did come back and say, I am still going to pray, but it's just really stressful right now. I said, good. That means you have stuff to pray about. She didn't like that one. She probably heard it like, good, you have stuff to pray about right now. See, because she was, you see? It works both ways. And the last thing is this: a dangerous prayer is very dangerous because you're asking God, point out anything. Maybe it's a sin. Maybe it's something that's an addiction that's not even a bad addiction, but it's taken precedence over God. Maybe it's something inside of you, the way you reacted to a certain situation. I don't know what it is. I'm not God. But that's why we ask him, point out anything in me that offends you. And the last thing, it says, and lead me along the path of everlasting life. This prayer is a simple prayer, but it's a dangerous prayer. So what I want to do tonight is I don't want to make this a guided prayer. I'm not going to walk you through any prayer. I just want us to pray tonight because I know this. One match by itself is pretty wimpy. One sparkler by itself is cool. But I like to burn things. And I took 3 10-pack sparklers and I put them together and I held them in my hand and I lit them all, and it like multiplied by like 50 and it burnt my hand before I could even let go of it. And then everything inside of me said, do 6-pack, but put them in the ground this time. So I did 6, I stuck them in the ground, I lit it, and it was just like, right? But what I do know is this, is that one sparkler by itself is great. One person praying by themselves is fantastic. But when we get all together, and we get greater prayer together, so tonight I just want to pray together. And I'm going to start with the song that we played during worship called Fresh Wind. And I just want, and I'm going to do it like I do with the teenagers. Are you ready? This I do with the teenagers. I got to be specific though. Find a spot somewhere in the room. Teenage girls, you cannot look at your ankles while you pray. Some of you don't get that. They all sit against the wall, bring their knees to their chest, and then look down at their ankles. Like, can't tell if you're really praying, so you can't sit like that. So let's all find somewhere in the room and let's pray together. All right?